"I don't need a pie, Miss Whitfield." He said it quietly. No anger, no cruelty, just the bare, exhausted truth of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be worth feeding. Clara stood in the rain with the warm pie in her hands and felt something crack open in her chest. Not pity, something sharper than that. She had buried a husband. She knew exactly what that voice sounded like. The voice of a person who had decided without telling anyone that they were finished deserving things. She didn't move. She didn't lower the pie. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and follow Clara and Ethan to the very end. Tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Wyoming Territory, 1983. Red Hollow was not a town that forgave weakness. It sat in a shallow valley between two ridges of gray stone, 30 miles from the nearest railroad depot. And the people who lived there had come to understand something about survival that no one back east seemed to fully grasp. You didn't make it on the frontier by asking for help. You made it by not needing any. That was the rule. That was the unspoken contract everyone in Red Hollow lived by, and anyone who couldn't abide by it usually didn't last through the second winter. Clara Whitfield understood that rule better than most. She had come to Red Hollow as a bride at 23 years old, following a man she loved and a dream she believed in, with the particular stubbornness of someone who had never yet been truly broken by the world. Her husband Thomas had been kind and hardworking and optimistic in the way that only young men with big plans can be. He had talked about the land with a passion that made her believe in it. Too good soil, he'd said, good water, good odds. And for 2 years they had built something together on a small claim east of town. Not much, but theirs. Then the fever came. It moved through Red Hollow in the late summer of 1881, like a fire moves through dry grass, fast and indiscriminate and deeply uninterested in what anyone had to lose. Thomas was gone in 11 days. Clara buried him under the cottonwood tree he'd always said he'd build a porch swing near. She sold the claim 14 weeks later because she had no choice. The debt didn't care about grief. The bank certainly didn't. At 25 years old, Clara Whitfield started over with $14 a rented room above the hardware store and a recipe for apple pie that her grandmother had written on the back of a church hymnal. She started selling baked goods from a board propped against her window, then from a cart in the market square, then eventually from a small rented space at the end of Main Street that she swept every morning before the sun came up and mopped every night after the last customer left. She called it nothing. There was no sign. There was just Clara and her oven, and the smell that drifted down the block every morning and pulled people in like a thread they couldn't refuse to follow. Her pies were talked about all the way to Casper, not because they were expensive, not because she used anything exotic or refined, but because every person who bit into one of Clara Whitfield's pies felt in some way they couldn't quite explain that someone had been thinking about them when they made it. There was something in the crust, some quality of attention, maybe some deliberateness, in the way each edge was pressed and each vent was cut that made a person feel seen. People came in tired and left softer. It happened again and again, and after a while, Clara's little shop became less of a bakery and more of a place people went when they couldn't name what was wrong, but knew they needed something. She charged fair prices. She gave extras when she could tell someone couldn't afford it, and she did it without making them feel small. She arrived before anyone else and left after everyone else, and never complained about either. She was by most measures the most quietly essential person in Red Hollow, and she was deeply, stubbornly, uncomplicatedly alone. Not lonely, she would have told you if you'd had the nerve to ask. Just alone. There was a difference. She had learned to live inside that difference with the same competence she brought to everything else efficiently, without waste, without complaint. She had a life. She had work she believed in. She had neighbors who respected her, and a few women she could call friends, in the careful way women on the frontier called anyone a friend, meaning they would help you if you needed it, and they trusted you to do the same. That was enough. That was what she told herself on the nights the kitchen felt too quiet, and the ache in her hands from the day's kneading reminded her that she was doing all of it alone. It was enough. It had to be enough. And then there was Ethan Calloway. He had come into her shop 8 months ago on the first real cold day of October, in the way that men like him always moved without hesitation, without ceremony, as if entering a room were simply a thing to be done and not a social negotiation. He was tall, with the kind of build that came from work rather than from nature. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that had been weathered into strong angles by the sun and the wind, and what looked to Clara like several years of not sleeping enough. He looked around the shop once the way a man looks at a room he's already decided not to like, and then his eyes landed on the pie shelf. "Apple," he said. "Yes," said Clara. "Plain, no cinnamon." "With cinnamon. I can make plain, but it'll be a day's notice." He looked at the pies for another moment. "With cinnamon is fine." He paid exact change, took the pie, and left without another word. He came back the following Saturday, then the next, then every week after that, without fail, through October and November, and into the first hard weeks of December. Always Saturday. Always apple. Always exact change. Always gone in under 3 minutes. Clara noticed things about people. She had learned to, because noticing was a kind of survival skill when you ran a business alone. You noticed who came in hungry, and who came in lonely, and who came in just to have somewhere to be for 5 minutes. She noticed the widow Mrs. Hart, who always asked after the rosehip jam, even though she never bought it, because it gave her a reason to talk. She noticed the Fletcher boy who came in on Fridays and spent 10 minutes pretending to look at bread before buying the cheapest cookie because his family was struggling and he didn't want to go home empty-handed. She noticed all of it, and it made her better at her job, and she accepted that as enough. She noticed Ethan Calloway too. He was not, she understood immediately, a man who came to her shop for comfort. He was not one of the people who sat a moment longer than necessary and let the warmth of the place do something for them. He bought the pie and he left, and he did not linger. And that alone told her something significant about him, that he was a man who had decided he didn't need comfort, or at the very least, that he'd decided it wasn't something he was allowed to want. She'd heard enough about him from other customers to fill in the outline. Ethan Calloway had owned the Calloway Ranch for 12 years. 340 acres northwest of town. Some of the best grazing land in the county, built up from 160 acres that his father had claimed, and then expanded by Ethan himself through 10 years of intelligent and relentless work. He was known for paying his hands well and expecting a great deal from them, which was considered by most people in Wyoming Territory to be a fair trade. He was known for being meticulous and honest and stubborn in the particular way of men who had decided very early that the world was a negotiation and they intended to win it. He had married at 29, a woman named Ruth, who by all accounts had been gentle and funny and had loved him in that direct, uncomplicated way of people who make love look easy. They had been married 4 years. Then Ruth had gotten sick, an illness that started slowly and then didn't stop, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, there was nothing to be done. She died in the spring of 1881, the same season Clara lost Thomas, and it had, by every account Clara could gather, done something to Ethan Calloway that couldn't be undone. Not broke him. He wasn't broken in the way people sometimes went when the world took too much from them too fast. The men who started drinking in the afternoon, the men who let their land go and their animals go and eventually themselves. Ethan Calloway kept his ranch running, kept his hands employed, kept every fence mended and every account settled and every obligation met. He was still, by all practical measures, entirely functional. But the laughter was gone, and the ease of him was gone, and the sense people had once had that he was someone who might on a good afternoon be genuinely glad to see you, that was gone too. What was left was competence, just competence, and a kind of courtesy that stopped so far short of warmth that some people mistook it for coldness. Clara did not mistake it for coldness. She looked at Ethan Calloway and saw someone who was working extremely hard at not feeling things, and she recognized that because she had been doing it herself for 2 years, and she was, if she was being honest with herself, quite tired of it. She never said any of this to him. They exchanged almost nothing in those months, pie payment, occasionally a brief remark about the weather. Once in November she had mentioned that she was trying a new buttercrust technique and asked if the texture seemed different to him, and he'd paused for what felt like a significant amount of time before saying, maybe a little more tender, and then leaving. That was the longest conversation they'd had. But she watched him. She watched him come in, and she watched the way his face did something just barely. Something, almost nothing. A flicker of something softening that came and went so quickly it might not have been there at all when he smelled the pies. And she watched the way he looked at the shop itself, not with the calculating eye of a man assessing a business, but with something else. Something she couldn't quite name. Like a man looking at something he had decided he didn't deserve. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon in late January when the thing happened. Clara had been at the oven since 4 in the morning because she had an order, 12 pies for a ranch wedding out toward Buffalo, a big commission that she needed, and by 2 in the afternoon, she was bone-tired and flour-dusted and moving on the particular kind of determination that lies on the other side of exhaustion. She heard the door open and knew by the sound of the footsteps, deliberate, even slightly heavy on the left side, a habit she'd noticed weeks ago, that it was him. She turned around and stopped. He looked different than she had ever seen him. His coat was soaked through at the shoulders, meaning he had been out in the rain long enough for it to matter. His jaw was set in the tight way of a man holding something back, and his eyes, when they met hers, for the brief moment they always met hers, had something in them she hadn't seen before. Not sadness. She knew what his sadness looked like by now, that flat, careful distance he carried everywhere. This was something worse. This was the look of a man who had passed through sadness and come out the other side into something more like exhaustion of the spirit. Like a man who had run out of reasons. She opened her mouth to say the usual thing. 1. Apple pie exact change, have a good evening, and she found she couldn't say it. He was already looking at the shelf. His hand was already in his jacket pocket finding the coins. "Mr. Calloway," she said. He looked up. She didn't think about what she was going to do next. She reached behind her, wrapped one of the warm pies she'd pulled from the oven 40 minutes ago in a length of cloth and walked toward him. Not behind the counter. Around it. She crossed the floor of her little shop and held it out. "I made this for you," she said. "It's still warm." He stared at it. The shop was very quiet. Outside, the rain came down steadily against the window glass. Somewhere down the street, someone was hammering something. The smell of butter and warm apple and cinnamon hung in the air between them. "Miss Whitfield," Ethan said, and his voice had something rough in it. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," she said. "I made extra." He looked at her for a moment, then down at the pie. "You always make extra," he said. He said it without accusation, just with a kind of quiet recognition that told her he had in fact been paying attention. More attention than she'd realized. "Yes," she admitted. Another silence. Longer this time. And then Ethan Calloway looked at her. Really looked at her in a way he had never done in all those Saturday mornings, and said something so quietly she almost didn't hear it over the rain. "I don't need a pie, Miss Whitfield." A breath. "I need to know why someone like you still believes I'm worth feeding." Clara felt the words land in her chest, the way cold water lands when you've stepped wrong into a creek, sudden and total and taking her breath away. Because he wasn't asking about the pie. He was asking about something that had been building in him for a long time, quietly under the surface of all those efficient Saturday mornings, and hearing it out loud in his flat, careful voice undid something in her she hadn't known was still wound so tight. She did not look away. "Because you are," she said simply. He didn't answer that. He stood there with the warm pie in his hands and the rain running off the brim of his hat, and something happening behind his eyes that she couldn't entirely read. Not sus, exactly, not yet, but something making room for softness. Some small door coming open an inch. "Sit down," she said. "The pie's better warm." He didn't move. "I've got coffee," she added. Another moment. And then, so slowly, it was almost reluctant. Ethan Calloway sat down at the small table near the window. He set his hat on the chair beside him. He looked out at the rain. Clara poured the coffee. She did not make conversation. She understood somehow that the most important thing right now was the absence of expectation, and she gave him that. She poured her own cup and stood at the counter and let the quiet sit between them without filling it with anything. He ate the pie. He did not say it was good, but he ate all of it, which was the same thing. After a while he said, looking still at the window, "My lead mare went lame this morning." "I'm sorry," Clara said. 3 days before we're supposed to push cattle up to the north pasture." A pause. "Been a long week." "It sounds like it." Silence again. But different silence. Not the silence of a man refusing connection. The silence of a man who has not spoken honestly with another person in so long that he has temporarily run out of the language for it. "Does she need rest or a farrier?" Clara asked. He glanced at her, surprised maybe that she knew to ask. "Both," he said. "Might be she'll come through fine." "Might be," Clara agreed. He looked at his coffee. "You know horses," he said. "Enough," she said. "My husband kept 2. I learned what I needed to." The word husband sat briefly in the air between them, acknowledged by both of them, with the particular kind of care that people who had both lost spouses brought to that specific word. He did not ask. She did not explain. And somehow the space that opened up between them in that moment was not awkward, but understanding. He finished his coffee and stood. "Thank you, Miss Whitfield," he said. "You're welcome, Mr. Calloway." He picked up his hat, reached into his pocket. "No," she said. He looked at her. "It was already made," she said. "Let it go." A long beat. And then for the first time in all the months she had known him, in all those efficient Saturday mornings, in all those brief exchanges. Ethan Calloway nodded. Not a polite nod. A real one. The kind that meant something. He walked to the door, opened it against the rain, and was gone. Clara stood at the window and watched him cross the muddy street to his horse and mount up with the ease of a man who had spent his whole life on horseback. She watched him turn north toward the ridge road and disappear into the gray curtain of the afternoon. Her coffee had gone cold. She hadn't noticed. She realized she was still holding the cloth she'd wrapped the pie in, pressed between both hands, and she made herself put it down and go back to her work. She had 4 more pies to finish before the wedding order was done. She had a floor to mop and an oven to clean and accounts to settle before she could sleep. She went back to work. But his voice stayed with her quiet and stripped of any attempt at dignity, carrying nothing but the raw truth of a man who had forgotten or decided he wasn't allowed to remember that he was still worth something to the world. It stayed in her chest like the warmth of her own oven, persistent and low and hard to ignore. She told herself it meant nothing particular. She told herself it was simply the consequence of spending 2 years learning to read people who came through her door needing something they couldn't ask for. She told herself that, and almost believed it. The following Saturday, Ethan came back. Same time, same manner of entering. But this time, before he could say a word about apple pie or exact change, Clara said, "How is the mare?" He stopped, looked at her. "Better," he said. "Good. A beat. Made it up to the north pasture after all." "I'm glad." He stood there turning his hat in his hands in a way she hadn't seen him do before. It was a gesture of slight uncertainty. She thought a man who had prepared himself for something and found the landscape different than expected. "I thought about what you said," he offered finally. Clara was sliding a pie off the rack. "I said several things. That I was worth feeding." She turned around and looked at him directly. "You are?" Ethan Calloway looked at a fixed point somewhere just to the left of her face. "My wife used to say something like that," he said, "when I was being stubborn." Clara understood what it cost him to say that. "She sounds like she was smart," Clara said. Something shifted in his face. Not pain exactly, something softer. "She was the smartest person I ever knew," he said, "including me, which isn't easy to admit." Clara smiled before she could help it. And Ethan Calloway, standing in her little bakery with the winter sun coming cold through the window glass, looked at her smile, and something in his chest, something he had assumed was sealed, permanently shut, moved, just slightly, just enough. He stayed 12 minutes that Saturday, the week after 16. The week after that, he brought in a small crate of dried apples from his cold storage and set it on her counter without preamble. "From last fall's trees," he said. Better than the mercantile stock. Clara looked at the apples, and then at him. You didn't have to do that. No, he agreed. He said it without apology, which made it feel like something other than a pleasantry, like a fact. Like he had made a decision about something, and he was not interested in walking it back. He turned to go. Mr. Calloway, she said. He turned. Thank you. He nodded. Same nod as before. The real kind. And then he left, and Clara stood looking at that crate of dried apples and thought that she was in a great deal of trouble, because she had been telling herself for months that she was simply being neighborly. Simply being the kind of person she had always tried to be attentive to people who were struggling generous when she could manage it. She had been telling herself that what she felt when she watched Ethan Calloway's face do that almost nothing softening thing was professional satisfaction. The satisfaction of a person whose particular skill was providing something people needed. She had been lying to herself, and she knew it, and she had known it for a while, and now she had a crate of dried apples on her counter as evidence. But that wasn't what troubled her. What troubled her was the conversation she overheard 3 days later between two women who had stopped in for sweet rolls, and who had not noticed that the back room where Clara was working had a gap in the wall partition that carried sound very clearly into the front of the shop. Saw Ethan Calloway in there again Saturday, said the first voice. Clara recognized it. Dorothea Marsh, the banker's wife, a woman who kept meticulous track of what everyone in Red Hollow was doing and with whom. Has he been going often? Said the second voice. Probably Mrs. Hennessy, her neighbor. 4 or 5 Saturdays in a row at least, said Dorothea Marsh, staying longer each time from what I've seen. Well, said Mrs. Hennessy, with a tone that Clara had learned to distrust in women who used it, I suppose someone like Clara would be very grateful for that kind of attention from a man like Ethan Calloway. A brief loaded pause. She's done very well for herself, said Dorothea Marsh in a voice that meant the opposite of what it said. For a widow in her position. That little bakery is a nice thing. Though I imagine running it alone at her age she must be practical, said Mrs. Hennessy. And they both laughed the particular laugh of women who have decided something unkind and are enjoying the agreement of it. Clara stayed very still in the back room. She had been holding a ball of dough, and she held it now with her hands completely quiet, because if she moved, she would break something. She understood exactly what they were saying, that she was chasing him, that she was a widow without prospects angling for a wealthy rancher, that whatever she had done, the pie, the coffee, the warmth she offered, without expecting anything in return, was calculation dressed up as kindness. The women left. Clara heard the door close. She stood in the back room for 3 minutes. Then she went to the sink and washed her hands with cold water, which she did when she needed to think clearly, and she looked at the dried apple crate sitting on the counter and felt something go flat in her chest. Because the worst part was not the cruelty of what they'd said. The worst part was the fear, small and cold, and deeply unwelcome, that people would say those same things to Ethan Calloway. That someone would find a way to plant that idea in his mind, that this widow was after his land and his money and his name, and that he would believe it. Not because he was a foolish man, but because a man who was already afraid of being hurt again needed very little information to decide that the risk wasn't worth it. She went back to work. She did not seek him out that week. She did not find excuses to walk past the hardware store where she knew he sometimes picked up supplies, and she did not save him a pie that she did not intend to save him. She worked. She kept her head down. She was sensible. But on Friday afternoon, a boy from the Calloway ranch appeared at her door with a note folded once unsigned in handwriting that she recognized immediately as economical and precise. The fence along the south road washed out in the thaw. You mentioned you used to go that way in the mornings. Take the creek path instead until it's fixed. It's longer, but it's dry. She read it twice. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't even a kindness exactly. It was practical information delivered with the directness of a man who had no patience for anything decorative. And it was the most clearly he had ever said, I have been paying attention to your life, and it matters to me that you don't come to harm. Clara folded the note. She tucked it into the small box where she kept her receipts and the deed to her shop and Thomas's wedding ring, and the handful of other things she had decided were worth keeping. And she thought you are already in too deep to pretend otherwise. She was right, and the consequences of that truth were coming, though she had no way yet of knowing how large they would be or how much they would ask of her, or whether in the end, the thing growing quietly between two careful broken people in a Wyoming Territory winter would be strong enough to survive what was coming next. She only knew, standing in her little kitchen with flour on her hands and the smell of warm apple filling the air, that for the first time in 2 years she had done something without calculating the cost first. She had handed a cold and broken man a warm pie, and she had meant every single word of it. The note stayed in Clara's box for 6 days before she did anything about it. She took the creek path every morning, just as he had suggested, and every morning she was aware of the fact that she was following his instructions, that she had, without any deliberation at all, simply trusted what he told her and adjusted her life accordingly. She was not sure what to make of that. She was not sure she wanted to make anything of it at all, because making something of it would require her to look directly at what was happening between them, and she had decided provisionally that looking at it directly was the one luxury she couldn't afford. She had a shop to run. She had a living to make. She had learned the hard way what it cost to let your attention wander from the practical things, and she was not going to make that mistake again. That was what she told herself on Monday. By Thursday, she had given up telling herself anything and simply accepted that the quiet, persistent warmth she felt every Saturday morning before he arrived was not something she was capable of arguing herself out of, and that the only reasonable response was to carry it carefully and not let it make her stupid. On Saturday, he arrived at his usual time. He looked better than he had the previous week. Less like a man carrying something he'd decided not to put down, more like a man who had at least set it down for a moment. There was something in the line of his shoulders that was marginally less braced. She noticed it the way she noticed everything about him now, with a clarity that was getting harder and harder to pretend was merely professional observation. "Creek path working out," he said without preamble. "It's longer," she said. "But yes. Fence'll be fixed by the end of the week." "I appreciate the warning," he nodded, looked at the shelf. "Apple." "Already set one aside," she said, and caught herself saying it, and watched something very subtle cross his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The place a smile comes from before it decides whether to commit. "That's," he started. "Don't say presumptuous," she said. "You come every week. It's practical." He looked at her for a moment. "I was going to say considerate." That stopped her. "Oh," she said. "But practical works too," he said, and there it was, small and quick and gone, almost before it arrived, but unmistakable. A smile. Not the polite social variety that men like him deployed to satisfy the requirements of civilized exchange. A real one. The kind that came from somewhere genuine and took the person wearing it slightly by surprise. Clara turned back to the shelf before she did something foolish with her own face. She wrapped the pie. She poured the coffee without being asked. He sat at the window table without being invited. Both of them noticed they were doing these things without discussion, that they had arrived at this small routine through a series of weeks that had rearranged both of them slightly without their explicit permission, and neither of them said a word about it, which was its own kind of conversation. He drank the coffee. She tallied the week's accounts at the counter. The shop was empty. It was late afternoon. The slow hour she'd long ago stopped trying to fill with customers she wasn't going to get. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She looked up. "You can ask." "The shop." He gestured at the room, at the shelves and the oven and the neat rows of products. "Was this always what you wanted? Or was it just—" He paused, searching for the right word, with the deliberateness of a man who didn't speak carelessly. "Just what you had available." Clara set down her pen. It was not the question she'd expected. It was a real question asked with real attention, the kind of question that assumed she had an interior life worth inquiring about, and the simple fact of being asked, it did something to her she hadn't anticipated. "Both," she said. "At first it was just survival. After Thomas died I needed income, and I had this skill, so I used it. But somewhere in the middle of needing it to survive, I found out I actually loved it." She paused. "Does that make sense?" Yes, he said immediately. And then quieter, yes, it does. She looked at him. The ranch, she said carefully. Same. A long pause. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. My father built it. I always knew it would be mine. I didn't choose it the way someone chooses a thing. It was just the shape my life was always going to take. He stopped. But after Ruth died, I understood why I'd wanted it. I'd always told myself it was about the land, the work. But it wasn't. Another pause longer. It was because I wanted something worth leaving someone. The silence after that was very full. And now, Clara said, because she couldn't help it. He looked at her steadily. Now I keep it running because letting it fail would mean everything it cost was for nothing. It was the most he had ever said in her presence. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard a man say without being prompted toward honesty by something dramatic. No crisis, no confrontation, just coffee and a slow afternoon and a woman who had asked the right question. She understood that this was not small. Men like Ethan Calloway did not speak this way to people they were merely being polite to. Whatever this was, whatever these Saturdays were becoming, it was not politeness. He seemed to realize he had said more than he intended because he set down the cup and reached for his hat. I should get back, he said. Of course, she said. He stood, paused at the door. Miss Whitfield. She looked up. I don't usually... He stopped, started again. I appreciate that you don't treat me like I'm something to be managed. She held his gaze. I treat you like a person, Mr. Calloway. Because you are one. He held her gaze for one moment longer than strictly necessary. Then he nodded, put on his hat, and walked out into the late afternoon cold. Clara stared at the closed door. She thought you are absolutely in too deep. She went back to her accounts. She could not make the numbers add up for 20 minutes, which was unprecedented, and she attributed it entirely to fatigue and refused to consider other explanations. What she did not know, could not know. Sitting in her little shop, with the oven cooling and the accounts spread in front of her, was that the same afternoon she was failing to make her numbers add up. Ethan Calloway was riding home through the last gray light of the day and having an argument with himself that he was losing badly. He had not intended the conversation to go the way it went. He had intended to buy the pie, drink the coffee, and maintain the careful distance he'd maintained successfully for 8 months before that first rainy Saturday broke something open. He had intended to be what he had trained himself to be since Ruth died: sufficient, self-contained. A man who needed nothing from anyone because needing things from people meant giving them the power to take something from you when they left. Ruth had not chosen to leave. He knew that. He had always known that. But the logic of grief did not operate on the basis of what you knew. It operated on the basis of what your body had learned in the worst moment of your life. And what his body had learned was that love was a thing that ended, and that the ending was unsurvivable. He had survived it once through sheer determination and a great deal of work. He was not convinced he could survive it again. So he had been careful. And then Clara Whitfield had walked around the counter with a warm pie in the rain and looked at him without pity or calculation or any of the other things people usually brought to their interactions with him, and said, because you are in a voice that had the quality of something so simple and direct that his entire system of careful distance had nothing to push against. He rode home and unsaddled his horse and told himself he was being foolish. How was 40 years old? He was a practical man. He had work to do and land to run, and not an ounce of patience for the kind of sentiment that led men to make bad decisions. He fed the horses and checked the fence line and did not think about Clara Whitfield. He thought about her the entire time. The following weeks moved in a rhythm that felt from the inside both completely natural and faintly astonishing. Natural because it had built so gradually that there was no single moment where either of them had made a decision. Each step was too small to be called a choice. Just a slight movement in the same direction as the step before. Astonishing because Ethan Calloway had believed with considerable certainty that he no longer possessed the capacity for this particular rhythm. The rhythm of two people learning each other. He started staying longer on Saturdays. Not dramatically longer. 10 minutes became 20, became 30. He began asking her questions that were not about pie or weather or the practical logistics of daily life, and she answered them and then asked her own, and he answered those too. They talked about Thomas not much and carefully, but enough that she understood he was not afraid of the subject. They talked about Ruth not much either, but with the same carefulness, the same deliberate respect that people bring to things that are both precious and painful. He learned that she had grown up in Ohio, that her father had been a school teacher, that she had read every book available to a woman of her means and circumstances, and would have read more if she could have gotten them. He learned that she had a laugh. She kept on a short leash, a real laugh, quick and unguarded, that arrived suddenly and departed just as fast as if she were always slightly surprised that something had gotten through her defenses. He learned that she kneaded dough when she was upset, and cleaned already clean surfaces when she was anxious, and went very quiet when she was angry, which was different from her regular quiet. She learned that he had read considerably more than anyone who knew him would have guessed, that he had opinions about things that had nothing to do with cattle or land, and kept those opinions to himself with the same discipline he applied to everything else. She learned that he was rigorous about fairness in a way that bordered on severity, that if he thought something was wrong, he didn't calculate the cost of saying so, he just said it, which had made him unpopular with certain powerful men in the county over the years, and which he regarded as an entirely acceptable trade. She learned that he had a habit of fixing things not just at his own ranch, but anywhere he happened to notice something broken. A wobbly chair leg in her shop one morning, mended without comment while she was in the back. A loose hinge on her door tightened while she was making change for another customer. He did these things the same way he had brought the dried apples, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, as if it would be strange to not fix a thing you noticed was broken. She learned that she had been right about him from the first. He was not cold. He was a man who had turned all his warmth inward to keep it safe, and it was still there, every bit of it preserved, intact, waiting. What neither of them had adequately accounted for was the town. Red Hollow was not a large place. It could sustain one bank, one hotel, 2 saloons, a general store, a church, a schoolhouse, a blacksmith, a doctor who was also the dentist, and one widowed baker whose pies were considered the finest in the county. It could sustain all of these things, and one thing more, which it had always sustained with great enthusiasm, the careful and comprehensive attention of its residents to each other's business. People had been watching Ethan Calloway's Saturdays for weeks. Clara knew this. She had known it since the afternoon she overheard Dorothea Marsh in the front of her shop, and she had conducted herself accordingly with complete normalcy, with no adjustment whatsoever to the way she treated him compared to any other customer, because she had decided that the moment she started managing what the town thought, she had given the town's opinion more power over her life than it deserved. What she had not anticipated was what happened on a Wednesday morning in late February, when she was at the Mercantile picking up a sack of sugar, and Hector Birch, who owned the livery and was Ethan's nearest neighbor, appeared beside her at the counter. Hector Birch was not a malicious man. He was an uncomplicated man who said what he thought without first considering whether it needed to be said, and who had been Ethan Calloway's nearest neighbor for 11 years, and considered that proximity to constitute a kind of friendship. "Miss Clara," he said, settling his elbows on the counter with the comfortable ease of a man who had nowhere pressing to be. "I hear Ethan's been spending considerable time at your place on Saturdays." "He buys pie," Clara said without looking up from her sugar. Hector scratched the side of his jaw. "Thing is, Clara, and I say this with all friendly intent, Ethan Calloway is not a man who does things without reason." "Most people aren't," she said. "What I mean is," Hector continued, and his voice took on the particular tone of a man who has appointed himself to deliver information that may not be welcome. "He's got people watching him, men in this county with interests in his land, in his operation. There's been talk, I won't say who, but there's men who wouldn't mind seeing Ethan make a bad decision about who he trusts." Clara put down the sugar and looked at him directly. "Are you telling me that someone thinks I'm a bad decision?" Hector at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I'm telling you that there are people in Red Hollow who have said, and again, I'm being friendly here, that a widow without property spending time with a wealthy rancher might have reasons that aren't purely about pie." The mercantile counter was very quiet for a moment. Clara picked up her sugar. "Mr. Birch," she said, "I have run my business alone for 2 years without asking anyone for anything. I have built something from nothing in a town that did not make that easy. I have never not once looked at Ethan Calloway or anyone else and thought about what they owned." She picked up her parcel. "If someone in this town has decided differently, they are free to think whatever they like. But I'd be grateful if you'd tell them in your friendly way that the people whose opinions matter to me could fit in my left hand." She walked out. She was 3 blocks away before her hands stopped shaking, and she was furious at herself for letting them shake at all. The anger carried her back to her shop and kept her company for most of the afternoon, which was useful because it kept her moving through a workday that she might otherwise have spent staring at nothing. But by evening, when she had closed up and was sitting in her kitchen with a cup of tea, she wasn't drinking. The anger settled into something quieter and considerably less comfortable, because Hector Birch's warning, even dressed up as it was in friendly concern, was a warning about something real. There were men in this county who did not want Ethan Calloway distracted from his business. There were men who watched land, the way wolves watched elk, with patience and with hunger, and with a specific interest in moments of vulnerability. She did not know who they were. She only knew from 2 years of running a business that depended on her understanding of how communities worked that they existed. And she knew that if those men decided to use her as a reason to destabilize Ethan, to paint him as a grieving widower, being manipulated by a woman without means, they would not be gentle about it. She sat with that knowledge for a long time. What she needed to decide was whether to tell him, and if she told him what she was actually saying. Because warning a man about gossip regarding the two of you was not a neutral act. It was a declaration whether you intended it or not. A declaration that you were paying attention to what the two of you looked like from the outside, which meant you had feelings about the two of you from the inside. And she was not prepared to make that declaration. She was not sure she was prepared to examine the feelings that would make it necessary. She went to bed without deciding anything. She woke up to a knock at the back door at 6:15 in the morning. She opened it to find Ethan Calloway, standing in the cold, with his hat in his hands, and an expression on his face that she had never seen before. Not the careful distance, not the almost smile, not the controlled propriety of their Saturdays. Something raw. Something that told her immediately that whatever had brought him here before dawn on a Wednesday had not given him any choice about coming. "Ethan," she said, and used his first name without thinking, which she had not done before. He noticed. A muscle in his jaw moved. "Something's happened," he said. She opened the door wider. He came in. She put the kettle on because she needed something to do with her hands. "Gerald Hoskins filed a lien on my south pasture," he said, "yesterday afternoon, before I'd even heard he was considering it." Clara turned around. "On what grounds?" "He's claiming I owe him for a water rights agreement from 3 years ago, says I never paid the final installment. It's not true." His voice was controlled, but only barely. "I have the receipts. I have the records. But a lien means the land is tied up until it's settled, and settling it through the county court means weeks, maybe longer. And in the meantime, I cannot transfer title, cannot use it as collateral, and Hoskins knows that. He knows I've been trying to expand the north grazing." He stopped. Clara was watching him very carefully. "Gerald Hoskins," she said slowly. "You know him." "He came into the shop once, big man, land office east of the creek." "That's him." She thought about Hector Birch at the mercantile counter. Men in this county with interests in his land. "Ethan," she said, 2 days ago someone told me there were men in town watching you, looking for a weakness." He went very still. "Who told you that?" "Hector Birch." He framed it as friendly advice, but the substance was that someone has been watching you and waiting for an opportunity. She paused. "I think Gerald Hoskins just created one." The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan set his hat on the table. He sat down, not in the chair he usually occupied on Saturdays, the one by the window, but at the kitchen table itself, which was different, which was closer, which felt like a different kind of being here. He put both hands on the table and looked at them. "How long have you known about this?" he said. 2 days. You didn't tell me. No. She sat down across from him. Because I was trying to figure out if telling you was something I had the right to do. Or if it was the kind of thing that would change what was between us in ways I hadn't decided I was ready for. He looked up at her. It was perhaps the most honest thing she had said to him since the pie in the rain, and it landed in the air between them with the particular weight of a thing that can't be taken back. What is between us? He said. His voice was quiet, not pressuring, genuinely asking. Clara met his gaze and held it. I don't know exactly, she said, but I know it's something. And I know I've been careful about it because careful is what I am, and because I didn't want either of us to make a decision about it for the wrong reasons. He held her gaze. And now someone filed a fraudulent lien on your land, and it might be connected to the same people who have been talking about me in connection with you. And I think we need to stop pretending this is only about Saturdays and apple pie. He breathed in slowly. Out. I have to go to the county courthouse today, he said. Find the attorney who helped me with the water agreement 3 years ago. Pull the records. I know. This could get complicated. Hoskins has connections. He's not going to back down easily. I know that too. He looked at her. Clara. First name. Deliberate this time. If whatever is between us becomes visible to people looking for leverage, it could be used against both of us. I know, she said. You know a great deal, he said. I've had 2 years to learn how this town works. I was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm going to need help with the records. The receipts go back 3 years. They're in 2 different ledger books, and my handwriting is... Bring them here, she said. He looked at her. Tonight if you can. I kept Thomas's accounts for 4 years. I know my way around a ledger. She held his gaze. And I know how to find a lie buried in numbers. Something shifted in his face, that door opening another inch. You don't have to do that, he said. No, she agreed. I don't have to. He understood. He was a man who understood the significance of I choose to versus I have to. She had come to understand a man who had spent the last 2 years believing no one would choose him. Not really. Not if they understood the full cost of it. He picked up his hat. At the door he paused. I'm sorry, he said, for coming before 6 in the morning. Don't be, she said. I've been up since 4. That almost smile again. Closer this time than it had ever been before. He left. Clara stood in her kitchen and listened to him right away, and thought about Gerald Hoskins and fraudulent liens and the invisible machinery of men with money and bad intentions, and under all of it persistent as her own heartbeat. The plain fact that Ethan Calloway had arrived at her back door before sunrise, because that was where he had come. Not to the attorney, not to his ranch hands, not to Hector Birch or any of the other men who had known him for years. Here. To her. She thought about what that meant. She decided, standing in her kitchen in the early morning cold, that she already knew. She went to the oven. She had pies to make and records to examine tonight, and whatever was coming, the lien, the men behind it, the visibleness of 2 careful people becoming something to each other. She was going to meet it the same way she'd met everything else on this frontier. On her feet, with her hands in the work, and without flinching. The ledgers arrived that evening, carried by the same boy from the Calloway ranch who had delivered the fence note. Ethan arrived an hour later. He sat across from her at the kitchen table with a lamp between them, and they went through 3 years of water rights records. In silence, broken only by the scratch of pencil and the occasional directed question. She found it in the 4th entry of the 2nd ledger. A payment, recorded in Ethan's hand, dated correctly amount, matching the receipt he pulled from his file, followed 7 entries later by a second line in slightly different ink that appeared to cancel the entry. Not written by Ethan, not in his hand at all. She put her finger on the line and didn't say anything. He leaned over, looked at it. His entire body went still. That's not my writing, he said. No, she said. It isn't. He looked at the 2 entries for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were hard with a cold, clear anger that was nothing like the contained pain she was used to seeing in him. This was different. This was a man who had just understood that someone had reached into his life and altered it without his knowledge, and who had decided in the way that some men decided things, that this would not stand. "Someone altered the ledger," he said. "Yes. After it left my possession." "It looks that way." He sat back. "The county records office," he said. "Hoskins has a cousin who works there." Clara looked at the entry. "This is evidence of fraud," she said. "Not just a disputed payment. Tampering with recorded documents is a criminal matter." "I need a lawyer," he said. "You need the right lawyer," she said. "Not someone Hoskins can reach." Howe was quiet for a moment. "There's a man in Casper, William Hart. He handled a property case for the Fowler family 2 years ago against a similar scheme. Won it." "That's who you call first thing tomorrow," she said. He was already writing the name. They stayed at the table for another 2 hours, going through every entry building, a complete picture of what had been altered and when, and what the original documents proved. Clara organized the evidence into order. She had a system clear and logical. The system of a woman who had kept her own accounts meticulously for years, because mistakes cost her money she could not afford to lose. By the time they finished, the lamp had burned low, and both their coffees had gone cold, and outside the wind had picked up considerably. Ethan gathered the ledgers. He looked at the organized stack of evidence she had compiled. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "I don't have words for," he started, and then stopped, which was characteristic of him reaching for something and finding that the language available to him wasn't adequate to what he meant. "Thank you," he said, and then quietly, "You have no idea what you just did for me." She did know. That was the thing. She knew exactly what she had done, and she had done it deliberately and without ambivalence, and she was not frightened of that. "Go get your lawyer," she said. "Deal with Hoskins, then come back." He held her gaze. "Come back," he repeated. "Saturday," she said. "Same as always." He nodded, put on his coat. At the door with the wind coming cold through the crack, he turned back one more time, and he looked at her. The way he had looked at her in the rainy afternoon, with that quality of a man seeing something he had decided he wasn't allowed to want, and finding that the decision no longer held. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He left. Clara blew out the lamp. She stood in the dark of her kitchen for a moment, listening to the wind, thinking about fraudulent liens and tampered ledgers, and a man riding home through the cold, with evidence that could unravel Gerald Hoskins's carefully laid scheme. She thought about what it meant that he had come to her. She thought about what it meant that she had been here ready, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this without knowing she was waiting for it. Outside, the Wyoming wind pushed hard against the walls of her little kitchen. She had built this. She had built all of this from nothing, $14 and a pie recipe, and 2 years of working before the sun came up and after it went down. She had survived things that should have broken her, and instead had made her into something she was on most days genuinely glad to be. She was not afraid of what was coming. She was not afraid of Gerald Hoskins, or the men behind him, or the whisper network of a small town that had already decided what she was and why. And she was not afraid. She realized this only now, only standing in the dark of her kitchen, after a man she cared for deeply had walked out the door of what she felt. That, of all things, was the most startling discovery. She was not afraid of it at all. William Hart arrived from Casper on a Thursday 3 days after Ethan sent the wire. I was not what Clara had pictured. She had expected the kind of attorney who came with a briefcase and a manner that made you feel the distance between his education and yours. William Hart was 50-something, compact with sharp eyes and the unhurried confidence of a man who had won enough difficult cases to stop being impressed by difficult cases. Ethan brought him into the bakery because the hotel walls were thin and he didn't trust thin walls, and Clara set coffee in front of both of them without being asked, and then started to move toward the back room. "Stay," Ethan said. She stopped. "She found the evidence," he told Hart. "She understands the ledgers better than I do." Hart looked at Clara with a reassessment that was quick and professional. "All right," he said. "Show me." She showed him. I went through the entries she had flagged, the altered cancellation line, the ink variation, the handwriting that was demonstrably not Ethan's, and his face did the thing good. Attorneys' faces do when they find what they came for. It went very still. "When did this ledger leave your possession?" he asked Ethan. 3 years ago when the water agreement was filed, county records office. And Hoskins' cousin works there. Has for 4 years. Hart tapped the page. This is alteration of a public record. That's not a civil matter, that's criminal fraud. The lien Hoskins filed is built on a falsified foundation. He looked up. It won't hold. But more than that, we can go after Hoskins directly. I want the lien removed, Ethan said. And I want it on record that it was filed fraudulently. That's the minimum, Hart said. He looked at Clara. You organized this. Yes. Good work. He said it the way he would have said it to a colleague without condescension, and she appreciated that more than she showed. I'll need your statement, a written account of how you found the discrepancy and what your assessment of the handwriting difference is. I can have that by tomorrow morning, she said. He nodded, looked at Ethan. Give me a week. Ethan gave him the week. What followed was the strangest 7 days of Clara's recent memory. Strange not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. The bakery opened every morning. The pies sold. The accounts added up the way they were supposed to add up. On the surface, her life looked exactly as it always had, and she understood now with the particular clarity of someone waiting for a thing to break open, how much of everyday life was simply the discipline of looking ordinary while everything underneath was in motion. She wrote her statement for Hart, in one sitting at the kitchen table, after close in the same careful hand she used for her accounts. She described what she had found, how she had found it, and what she knew of ledger-keeping and record-keeping from 4 years of managing her husband's accounts and 2 years of managing her own. She was precise, and she was thorough, and she did not editorialize because she understood that the most useful thing a statement could be was clear. She sent it with the ranch boy the following morning. She did not see Ethan. He was, she knew, in Casper with Hart gathering additional documentation from the original filing. He had sent word through the same boy he would be back by the weekend. The note was 3 lines long, entirely practical, and told her nothing about how he was, or what he was thinking, or whether he was sleeping, which were the 3 things she actually wanted to know. She told herself this was appropriate. They were not whatever they were to each other. They were not at a place where she had the right to expect anything beyond what he chose to offer. She had made that calculation deliberately, and she was going to live by it. She was finding the calculation harder to live by with each passing day, which annoyed her considerably. On Friday, Dorothea Marsh came into the shop. This was not unusual. Dorothea Marsh bought a pie from Clara roughly once a week, and their interactions were always the same. Courteous surface level, the kind of exchange that 2 women who do not trust each other maintain when they must coexist in the same small town. Clara was good at it. She could conduct this kind of interaction with one part of her mind while the rest of her was entirely elsewhere. But today, Dorothea lingered. She bought her pie and then stood at the counter, and Clara recognized the particular quality of her lingering. It was the lingering of a woman who had come to say something and was deciding how to dress it. I heard William Hart is in town, Dorothea said. Is he? Said Clara. From Casper. He handled the Fowler case, you know. I've heard that. Gerald Hoskins is very upset. Dorothea watched Clara's face carefully. They say there's been some trouble with a land filing. People say a great many things, Clara said, and smiled pleasantly and slid the pie across the counter. Dorothea didn't take it yet. Clara, she said, dropping the formal pleasantry, and her voice shifted into something that was either genuine concern or a very convincing imitation of it. I want to say something as I want to say it plainly. Please do. Gerald Hoskins is not a man who loses gracefully. If Ethan Calloway is moving against him... She paused. There are people who will look for the easiest way to apply pressure, and the easiest pressure isn't always applied to the man himself. Clara looked at her steadily. Are you warning me? She said. Dorothea Marsh held her gaze. I am telling you to be careful. What you choose to do with that is your own business. She took the pie and left. Clara watched the door close. She thought about the 2 versions of Dorothea Marsh, the woman who had laughed at the counter with Mrs. Hennessy about a practical widow chasing a wealthy rancher, and the woman who had just looked at her with what felt against all Clara's instincts like something real. She was not sure the two versions were incompatible. People were rarely one thing. She knew that better than most. She was still thinking about it when the door opened again 20 minutes later, and a man she had never seen before walked in. He was well-dressed, too well-dressed for a casual visit to a bakery in Red Hollow, and he had the kind of manner that people cultivated when they wanted to seem like less than they were. Soft-spoken, deferential. A manner that said, "I am no threat," in a way that told Clara immediately he was exactly that. "Miss Whitfield," he said pleasantly. She had not told him her name. "What can I get you?" she said. "Oh, I'm not here for the baked goods, I'm afraid." He smiled. "My name is Patterson. I work for Mr. Hoskins." The shop was not busy. There was one other customer in the back corner who was not paying attention. Clara kept her hands on the counter and her face neutral. "Is that right?" she said. "Mr. Hoskins wanted me to convey his regards," Patterson said, "and to mention purely informally that he is aware of the assistance you've been providing to Mr. Calloway, with the records." "I help a lot of customers," Clara said. "It's a bakery." Patterson's smile didn't change. "Of course. Mr. Hoskins simply wanted to note that he has considerable connections in this county. Business connections. And that he would consider it a personal kindness if the records you've organized were to become slightly less organized, or perhaps incomplete." The air in the shop went very flat. "Are you suggesting," Clara said quietly, and without any inflection at all, "that I tamper with evidence?" "I'm suggesting nothing of the kind," Patterson said smoothly. "I'm simply relaying Mr. Hoskins's hope that this unfortunate situation might be resolved quietly, without anyone's reputation suffering unnecessarily." A pause. "He mentioned that a bakery of this size operating on a rented space might benefit from certain considerations. Lease terms, for instance. Mr. Hoskins has connections with the property office." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Patterson," she said, "tell Mr. Hoskins that the records are complete, accurate, and in the possession of an attorney in Casper. Tell him that any pressure applied to my business or my lease will be reported to that same attorney in writing the same day it occurs. And tell him," she leaned forward slightly, just slightly, "that I have been running this bakery alone for 2 years, against considerably worse odds than Gerald Hoskins, and I have not lost yet." Patterson's smile had faded. "Good morning," Clara said. He left. Her hands were shaking under the counter where he couldn't see them. She pressed them flat against the wood and breathed slowly, and did not let herself move for 60 seconds, which was how long it took for the shaking to stop. Then she went to the back room and wrote everything Patterson had said into a letter, word for word signed and dated, sealed it, and gave it to the baker's boy, with instructions to take it to the hotel where she knew William Hart was still staying before he left for Casper. She went back to the oven. By noon, she had baked 11 pies. The oven required constant attention and gave her no room to think about anything else, which was exactly why she had chosen it. Ethan arrived back from Casper on Saturday, not at his usual time, but late morning, and he came directly to the shop with Hart at his side, and a look on his face that she had not seen before. The look of a man who had spent a week at war and come back carrying both the exhaustion and the particular aliveness that combat produced in people built for it. He saw her face the moment he walked in. "What happened?" he said. She told him about Patterson. All of it word for word, the same way she'd written it for Hart. Ethan's expression went through several things very quickly. Recognition, anger, and then something cold and completely controlled that was more frightening than anger because it was so deliberate. "He threatened your lease," he said. "He implied it." "That's a threat." "I know." He turned to Hart. Hart had already produced the letter she'd sent to the hotel. "Bribery and intimidation of a witness," Hart said almost to himself. "That's no longer a property dispute." He looked up at Ethan. "This has become a criminal matter, which is better for us and considerably worse for Hoskins." "File it," Ethan said. "I intend to." Hart gathered his papers. "I'll go wire the county sheriff from Casper. Expect movement by midweek." He looked at Clara. "Well done, Miss Whitfield. That letter is going to matter." He left. The shop was suddenly very quiet with just the two of them. Ethan looked at Clara. He left. The shop was suddenly very quiet with just the two of them. Ethan looked at Clara with the kind of directness that she had come to understand was his version of everything, the way other men used words. He used the quality of his attention, and when he turned it on her without filter, it was considerable. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Clara." "I was frightened," she said, "for about 60 seconds. Then I wrote the letter and went back to the oven." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face. "I brought this to your door," he said. "You didn't bring anything. Hoskins came. Because of me." "Ethan." She looked at him directly. "I knew what I was doing when I helped you. I'm not a woman who makes decisions without understanding the consequences." "I know that," he said. "That's not what I—" He stopped, pressed both hands flat on the counter, a gesture she now recognized in him, the way he physically anchored himself when he was working through something he hadn't found language for yet. "I have spent 2 years making sure no one could be hurt because of me," he said. "I have been very careful about it. And then, in the space of 2 months, you've been threatened, gossiped about, and maneuvered against. Because of me. Because of Hoskins," she said. "Because of my land," he said. "Which is mine, my problem." She came around the counter. Not all the way to him, she stopped a few feet away, which was close enough to be deliberate. "Ethan," she said. "What happened 2 years ago with Ruth? You've made yourself into a man who keeps everything at a distance so that losing things can't touch you. I understand that. I have done versions of the same thing." She held his gaze. "But keeping everything at a distance didn't keep Hoskins away. It didn't keep the gossip away. All it kept away was the people who might have been standing beside you." He didn't answer. "I am not asking you to stop being careful," she said. "I am asking you to notice that being careful didn't protect me from Patterson walking through my door. And it didn't protect you from a fraudulent lien on your land. The only thing being careful did was make sure you faced it alone." He looked at her. His jaw was tight. "I don't know how to do this differently," he said. Low, honest. The kind of admission that cost him something real. 2 years ago, I watched someone I loved disappear, and there was nothing I could do. Nothing. And I have spent every day since then making sure nothing is ever outside my control again." "I know," she said. You can't know what it's like to be the person who was supposed to—" "I buried my husband," she said quietly. He stopped. She let that sit. "I know exactly what it costs," she said. "I know what it takes out of you to get up the next morning and the morning after that and keep going. When everything that made going somewhere feel worth it is gone. I know what it's like to turn yourself into someone efficient and self-sufficient and completely without need, because needing things is what breaks you open and you cannot afford to be broken open again." She looked at him. "I know all of it. And I am telling you from the other side of 2 years of knowing it that it doesn't actually protect you. It just makes you lonelier." His breathing had changed. "She would have liked you," he said suddenly, quietly, not looking at her. Clara went very still. Ruth. She liked people who said exactly what they meant. She had no patience for anything indirect. A pause. "She would have had me sorted out in about 4 minutes. Clara smiled, even though her chest was aching. "She sounds like she was remarkable," she said. "She was." He looked at his hands. "I'm not trying to replace her. I want you to know that. What I felt for her, that was its own thing, and it's still its own thing, and it always will be. But I've been using it." He stopped, started again slower. "I've been using grief as a reason to refuse everything, and I'm not sure anymore that she would have wanted that." The quiet in the shop was different now. Not the cautious quiet of 2 people managing the distance between them. The quiet of something that has been building for a long time and has finally decided to arrive. "She wouldn't," Clara said. "If she loved you, she wouldn't have wanted that." He looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because I loved Thomas," she said. "And the last thing I would want, the very last thing, is for him to have locked himself up so tight that nothing good could ever reach him again." He didn't speak for a moment. Then, "I don't know how to start," You already started, she said. You started the afternoon you sat down at that table and drank coffee instead of leaving. He thought about that. Something shifted in him, she could see it, something unclenching. The lion, he said, coming back to practical ground, the way men like him always did, when the emotional territory got too exposed. Hart thinks midweek. Good. And Hoskins. Hart will handle it. And you. Your lease, your shop. Ethan. She said it firmly. I told you, I have not lost yet. He looked at her for a long moment. And then, he did something she hadn't expected. He reached across the counter and put his hand over hers, not dramatically, not with any of the theater that gesture might have carried in another man. Just set his hand over hers, warm and solid, and completely direct. All right, he said. They stood like that for a moment. She didn't move her hand. Neither did he. Sit down, she said finally. I'll make coffee. He sat. She made coffee, and outside Red Hollow went about its ordinary Saturday business, entirely unaware that in the little bakery at the end of Main Street, two people who had each spent 2 years becoming very good at needing nothing were quietly, carefully, irreversibly beginning to need each other. The midweek reckoning came on a Tuesday. Hart had moved faster than Hoskins had anticipated, which was the point. The county sheriff arrived from the district seat with 2 deputies and a warrant that covered not only the fraudulent lien, but the attempted bribery of a material witness, which was what Patterson's visit to Clara's shop had become the moment she documented it. Clara knew what was happening only because Hart sent the ranch boy with a note, Hoskins taken in for questioning. Lien suspended pending investigation. Will confirm full resolution by Friday. She read the note twice, put it in her box with the others, and went back to her oven. She was not naive enough to think it was over. Men like Hoskins had resources and connections and lawyers of their own, and the law in Wyoming Territory moved according to a logic that was not always predictable. But the lien was suspended. The fraud was on record. And Patterson had made the critical mistake of threatening a woman who immediately wrote everything down. What she did not anticipate. And this was the thing that cracked her composure in a way that Hoskins's man walking through her door had not, was who came through her door on Wednesday morning. Not Ethan. Not Hart. Not anyone she recognized. It was Hector Birch. He came in quietly, which was unusual for a man of his size and general volume, and he stood at the counter and looked at her with something in his face that she hadn't expected from him either. I owe you an apology, he said. She looked at him. What I said to you at the mercantile, about you and Ethan, about people's opinions. He turned his hat in his hands, same gesture as Ethan. She noticed the gesture of a big man who feels small and doesn't know what to do with his hands. I dressed it up as concern, but what I actually said was that people thought you were after his money, and you didn't deserve that. Clara looked at him for a moment. No, she said. I didn't. I know that now. I knew it then too, if I'm honest. I was carrying someone else's opinions, and I repeated them, and that was wrong. He met her eyes. Ethan told me what you found in those ledgers. What you did. A pause. A woman who wanted a man's money would have let the lien stand and consoled him through losing the land. You did the opposite. The shop was very quiet. Thank you, Clara said. She meant it simply. Hector nodded. He looked around the shop, clearly a man who had delivered the difficult thing and now needed an easier one to stand on. I'll take 2 of whatever's fresh. She sold him 2 apple pies. He paid and left, and she stood at the counter afterward with her hands very still and thought about the strange, circuitous way that truth moved through a small community, slowly through wrong turns and corrections, reaching people at different speeds in different ways, but reaching them eventually. It reached Ethan differently. He came on Saturday as he always did, but this Saturday was unlike any of the others that had preceded it. He came without his usual guardedness, without the familiar, slightly braced quality of a man keeping himself at the ready. He came loose in the way of someone who has set down something heavy and is still getting used to the absence of the weight. He sat at the table. She poured the coffee. He ate the pie. All the same. But the quality of the quiet between them was different, not managed, not careful, not 2 people deciding how much to reveal. Just two people sitting together and finding it sufficient. Hart says the lien will be formally removed by end of next week, he said. That's good. Hoskins's cousin has been let go from the records office. They're reviewing other filings he may have touched. Also good. And Hoskins himself. He paused. Hart says the bribery charge carries real teeth. He'll be fighting that for a while. Good, Clara said again. Ethan looked at her. You're very calm about all of this. I've been calm about it since Tuesday, she said. I was considerably less calm on the Friday before that. You didn't show it. I've had practice. He looked at her. That steady, unguarded look that she had come to understand was his version of saying something he hadn't yet found words for. She had learned to wait for it. I want to ask you something, he said. Ask. The night we went through the ledgers, you said... He stopped, organized his thoughts the deliberate way he always did. You said we needed to stop pretending this was only about Saturdays and apple pie. I remember. I've been thinking about what it is instead. She looked at him. Her coffee cup was warm between her hands. Outside, the February wind made sounds against the window glass. So have I, she said. And... She took a breath. She had told herself she would not be the one to name it first. She had told herself she would let him come to it in his own time, in his own way, because he was a man who needed to come to things at his own pace, and she respected that. She had told herself a great number of things. I think you know what I think, she said. I want to hear it, he said. Not because I'm uncertain, because I think you've been carrying it carefully for a long time, and I would like you to be able to put it down. She looked at him. That undid her just slightly, the precision of it, the accuracy of it, the fact that he had been paying that quality of attention. I care about you, she said. Not what you own, not what you can provide, you. The man who mended my chair leg without saying a word about it. The man who warned me about a washed-out road because he noticed which way I walked in the mornings. The man who sat at my kitchen table at 10:30 at night going through ledgers because he didn't know who else to bring them to. She met his eyes. That's who I care about. Ethan Calloway sat very still. I have been afraid, he said, for 2 years, that caring about someone again would mean giving them the ability to destroy something I couldn't rebuild. I know. I'm still afraid of that. I know that too. He looked at his coffee, then at her. But I think, he said slowly, that what I'm more afraid of, what I've been more afraid of for a while now, and just wasn't willing to admit, is looking back in another 2 years and realizing I had the chance, and I let the fear win. The shop was very quiet. Ethan, she said. Yes. I'm going to need you to say the rest of it plainly. You're a man who says things plainly, and I think that's one of the things I admire most about you, and I think you should use that quality right now. He almost smiled. It was close. I would like, he said carefully, to stop being careful, with you, if you're willing. She looked at him for a long moment. The winter light came through the window. The smell of warm apple and butter and cinnamon filled the space between them. The same smell that had been the backdrop to all of this, from the first rainy Saturday, to this one steady and warm, and she thought entirely appropriate. Yes, she said. I'm willing. He reached across the table and took her hand, the same way he had reached across the counter on Saturday Direct Simple No Theater. Just an honest man doing an honest thing. They sat like that while the coffee cooled. And neither of them moved to warm it up because neither of them was in any hurry to go anywhere. But Clara knew, even in that quiet, that this peace they'd arrived at was not the end of anything. Hoskins was still fighting. The county machinery was still grinding through his connections, his filings, his careful network of influence. And beyond Hoskins, there was still the harder work, the work of two people who had each built high, careful walls, learning to let each other through those walls without losing themselves in the process. She knew that. She had never expected simple. But sitting across from Ethan Calloway in her little bakery with his hand over hers and the winter light on his face, she thought that complicated, if it was the right kind of complicated, was worth every bit of what it cost. She was right. And what it was about to cost was considerably more than either of them yet knew. The formal removal of the lien came on a Friday, 9 days after Hart had filed the criminal complaint. Ethan received the paperwork at his ranch in the morning and rode directly to Clara's shop, which was something he had not done before. Coming on a day that wasn't Saturday, coming without the structure of their established routine, to give the visit a shape that felt safe. He walked through the door while she was serving 2 customers, and he waited standing near the window with his hat in his hand, and both customers noticed him standing there and were gone inside of 4 minutes. Clara looked at him across the empty shop. He held up the document. She let out a breath she had been holding, she realized, for the better part of 2 weeks. "It's done," she said. "The lien is removed. The south pasture is clear." He set this document on the counter. "Hart says the criminal complaint against Hoskins will take longer months possibly, but the land is free." She looked at the document. The official stamp. The date. The formal language that meant in plain terms that Gerald Hoskins had failed. "Good," she said. Ethan was watching her face. "That's the second time you've said good and meant a great deal more than the word." "I'm economical," she said. "You are," he agreed. And then he came around the counter, not the first time he had been on her side of it, but the first time he had done it with intent, with the deliberate quality of a man crossing a line he had decided to cross, and he stood close enough that she had to look up at him, and he said quietly, "Thank you, Clara, for all of it." She looked at him. "You already thanked me." "Not adequately." "Ethan, I know what it cost you," he said. "Patterson in your shop, the gossip before that, your lease being threatened." His jaw was tight. "I know what you put at risk, and I know you did it because of what we said on Saturday. And I want you to know that I understand what that means, what it took." She held his gaze. "It took less than you think," she said. "That's what I want you to understand. It wasn't a sacrifice. It was a choice I made because I wanted to make it." He looked at her for a moment. Something in him settled the particular settling of a man who has been carrying guilt about something and has just been given permission to put it down. "All right," he said. "Good." He almost smiled. "You know most people use that word as a placeholder. I use it as a complete sentence." This time, the smile arrived fully unguarded, the real version that she had seen only a handful of times, and it did to her what it always did, made her feel briefly like the world had expanded by some small but significant margin. She turned back to the counter before she did something foolish. "Hart's billing," she said. "Is it manageable?" "Yes. And he's already talking about recouping costs from Hoskins if the criminal case succeeds." "It will succeed. The evidence is clean." He leaned against the counter beside her. Not across it. Beside it. The physical grammar of their interactions had shifted since Saturday, and they were both learning to navigate the new language of it. The closer proximity, the ease of it, the way that ease was still slightly startling to both of them. "He's talking about other cases," Ethan said. "Hart. He says Hoskins has used this water rights strategy before. 2 other ranchers in the county may have the same falsified records." Clara looked at him sharply. "Then they need to know." "Hart's already looking into it." "Good. Because if Hoskins has been running this as a pattern, the county recorder's office has a larger problem than one corrupt clerk." Ethan looked at her sideways. "You think like a lawyer." "I think like a woman who has kept her own accounts and fought her own battles for 2 years, she said, "which is similar." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Come to the ranch this Sunday." She looked at him. "Not, I'm not." He paused, organizing himself. "I want to show you something. The south pasture, the land that was at risk. I want you to see what you helped protect." She understood what he was actually saying. "I want you in my life in a form that exists outside this bakery." It was an invitation beyond the Saturdays, beyond the careful middle ground they had occupied for months. It was forward motion. "All right," she said. "Sunday." He nodded, put on his hat. "Ethan," she said. He turned. "Bring the horse that went lame in January. I want to see how she's moving." He looked at her for a moment, with that expression she had come to know. The one that meant she had said something that surprised him by being more attentive than he had expected, which still happened, which told her that he had not yet fully adjusted to being seen this carefully. "She's moving well," he said. "Good," said Clara. "But I want to see for myself." He left. She stood at the counter for a moment in the quiet of the empty shop, and she was aware of a feeling she hadn't had in a long time, a clean, uncluttered anticipation. Not the anxious kind, the good kind. The kind that comes when something you have been hoping for has stopped being a hope and started being a plan. She went back to work. Sunday came clear and cold, the kind of Wyoming winter morning that looked beautiful from indoors and required serious preparation outdoors. Clara wore her heaviest coat and borrowed a pair of riding gloves from her neighbor Mrs. Fowler, who lent them without asking any questions that she wanted answered. She arrived at the Calloway ranch at 9:30, having taken the main road because the creek path felt somehow like it belonged to an earlier chapter. The ranch was larger than she had pictured. She had built it in her mind from the pieces she'd gathered over months. 340 acres. Good grazing, well maintained, but knowing those facts and standing inside them were different things. She arrived in the yard, and a ranch hand she didn't recognize came to take her horse, nodding with the polite deference of a man who had been told to expect her, which meant Ethan had told his people she was coming, which meant this had been considered. Ethan came out of his barn before the hand had finished with the horse. He was dressed for work, rather than for visiting, and she was glad of it. She had no interest in ceremony, and a man in his working clothes told her more about him than a man dressed to receive company. "You found it," he said. "Main road," she said, "not the creek path." Something in his face acknowledged the distinction. "Come on." He showed her the ranch, the way a man shows a person, something he made with his own hands, with a quietness that was more eloquent than description. Pausing at things that mattered without over-explaining why they mattered, watching her face to see what she noticed. She noticed the quality of the fences, which were meticulous. She noticed the condition of the horses, which were well. She noticed the way the ranch hands moved, not nervously, not with the particular watchfulness of men working for a difficult employer, but with the ease of people who knew what was expected of them and trusted the man setting the expectations. She noticed that every hand they passed greeted Ethan with a directness that suggested respect rather than fear, and that he knew each of their names and used them, and that one very young hand, who could not have been more than 17, was shown how to properly tension a fence wire by Ethan himself, standing in the cold with his breath making small clouds, patient and precise. She watched that for a moment longer than she watched anything else. When they were clear of the yard and moving toward the south pasture, she said, "How long has the young one been with you?" "Tommy, 4 months. He came off a failed claim east of Sheridan. Father couldn't make it work, family went back east. Tommy didn't want to go." "And you kept him on." "He works hard and he learns fast." A pause. "He reminded me of myself at 17. Clara walked beside him and thought about a 17-year-old Ethan Calloway learning the land that would eventually become everything he'd worked toward before loss had taught him to be careful. "You're good with them," she said. "Your people." "I ask a lot," he said. "Fair asking with fair payment," she said. "That's different from asking a lot." He looked at her. "You've been watching." "I always watch," she said. They reached the south pasture. The land opened up broad and gray-white, with the remnants of snow, the grass beneath showing through in patches. It was not dramatic country. It was working country, the kind of land that rewarded attention rather than inspiring wonder, and she found she liked it precisely because of that. "This is what he wanted," Ethan said. He was looking at the pasture, not at her. "Hoskins, he owns the creek rights on the eastern boundary. If he'd gotten the south pasture through the lien, he'd have controlled the water access for my entire north grazing operation." A pause. "He'd have had me in 18 months. Clara looked at the land. "He nearly did it," she said. "Yes." "And instead he's facing criminal charges." "Yes." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the pasture, and she could see the full weight of it on his face. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but the profound and quiet feeling of a man who has looked directly at the thing that nearly destroyed what he built, and found it has not destroyed it after all. It was a specific kind of gratitude that had no real name. Ruth loved this pasture, he said, very quietly, not looking at her. She did not say anything. She used to ride out here in the evenings, said it was the best light on the ranch. He paused. I haven't come out here much since she died. It was the first place that felt I couldn't be here without... He stopped. I know, Clara said. I wanted you to see it, he said. Because the person who helped me keep it should see it. He turned and looked at her. And because I wanted to come back here without it being only about her. Without it being only about what I lost. He held her gaze. That's why I asked you to come. Clara looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved across the pasture between them. Thank you, she said, for telling me that. He nodded. They stood for a while in the cold and looked at the land together, and the silence between them was the good kind, the kind that didn't need anything added to it. They were almost back to the yard when one of the hands came toward them at a pace that said something was wrong. Mr. Calloway. It was the older foreman, a steady man named Pete, who Clara had seen once or twice in town. Wire just came from town, from a Mr. Hart. Ethan took the paper. Read it. His face did not change. It went to the controlled blankness that Clara now knew was how he looked when something significant required him to think before he reacted. He handed it to her. She read it. Hoskins had gotten to one of the county commissioners. Not a minor official, the commissioner who oversaw property disputes. The criminal complaint had not been dismissed, but it had been rerouted through a panel that Hoskins had influence with, and Hart was warning that the process would be delayed, and that during the delay, Hoskins's attorneys intended to file a counter-complaint against Ethan for defamation. The basis of the counter-complaint that Ethan had conspired with his, and here, Hart had written the word that the filing used companion to fabricate evidence against a legitimate creditor. Clara read the word companion with the particular care of someone reading a word that has been chosen to mean something specific. He's using me as the fabrication angle, she said. Yes. He's saying we manufactured the ledger evidence together. That's what his attorneys will argue. She handed the paper back to Ethan. She was thinking fast, sorting through the implications with the same methodical attention she brought to any ledger. Hart still has the original documents, the ink variation, the handwriting analysis, which Hoskins will argue were altered after the fact. By whom? Two people with no legal training and no access to the county records office. By a woman with something to gain, Ethan said. His voice was flat, not accusing, informing. He was watching her face with the careful attention of a man who understands that the person in front of him is hearing a hard thing, and he wants to know how they're taking it. She looked at him steadily. I have the letter Patterson delivered, signed, dated, his exact words. That's his attempt to suppress evidence. Hart has it. Then Hart needs to lead with it. Before Hoskins can establish his version of events, Hart needs Patterson's visit on the record as Exhibit 1. Ethan was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the almost smile, not the steady assessment. Something different. Something that looked, she thought, very much like the moment a person stops being surprised that someone is exceptional and starts simply accepting it as a fact. I'll wire Hart today, he said. Tell him Patterson's letter reframes the entire counter-complaint. Hoskins sent a man to bribe or threaten a witness. That's not what innocent men do. That's what men do when they know the evidence is real and they need it gone. Yes, Ethan said. And tell him. She paused, took a breath. Tell him I'm prepared to testify, in open court if it comes to it, about what I found, how I found it, and what Patterson said in my shop. Ethan went very still. Clara, that would put you directly. I know what it would do, she said. In a public proceeding, with Hoskins's attorneys trying to make you out as a scheming widow, she said. Yes, I've heard that argument. I have been hearing versions of it for 2 months. She looked at him. I am not afraid of it, Ethan. I know what I did and why I did it, and it will hold up to any examination because it's true. And the truth is considerably more durable than a rumor if you give it enough air. He looked at her for a long time. You don't have to do this, he said. No, she agreed. I don't have to do anything. I choose to. She held his gaze. Stop treating my choices as debts you owe me. I'm not keeping score. Something in his face broke open, not dramatically, not with any of the theater that phrase usually suggests, but quietly, the way ice breaks in spring. Not all at once, but at the point where it had been thinning for a long time. He reached out and took her hand, not across a counter this time, not across a table. They were standing in an open yard in the cold, and he took her hand the way a man takes a hand when he is not thinking about what it looks like or what it means, when he is only thinking that he needs to hold on to something real. All right, he said. She held his hand. The foreman Pete was somewhere behind them, and she was aware of that and did not care. Wirehart, she said. I'll be at the shop tomorrow if he needs to talk through the testimony. He nodded. His hand tightened slightly on hers just for a moment, and then he let go because he was a practical man, and there was a wire to send, and a county commissioner to worry about, and a case to win. But he let go slowly. She rode back to Red Hollow in the late morning and went straight to her oven because she had 3 days of orders to catch up on, and the world did not stop requiring pie simply because legal proceedings were becoming complicated. She worked through the afternoon with the single-minded focus that was her greatest practical skill, and she let the rhythm of the work carry her through the parts of the day that required not thinking about things too hard. The complication she hadn't anticipated arrived on Monday. Not from Hoskins. Not from any of the legal machinery that Hart was managing in Casper. It came from a source she should perhaps have seen coming and hadn't. It came from her own side. A woman named Agnes Fairbanks, who had arrived in Red Hollow the previous autumn and opened a dressmaking shop 2 doors down from Clara's bakery, knocked on Clara's back door at 7:30 in the morning, with a look on her face that said she had been turning something over for a while and had finally decided to say it. Agnes was not unkind. She was brisk and honest, and had shown Clara the kind of collegial warmth that businesswomen in small frontier towns sometimes offered each other simply because no one else fully understood the particular challenges of the work. Clara liked her. More to the point, she trusted her, which was not the same thing and was rarer. I'm going to say something, Agnes said without sitting down, and I want you to hear it as coming from someone who is on your side. Say it, said Clara. People are talking about what's happening with Hoskins and the lien and all of it, and the story they're building. Agnes paused. The story they're building is not kind to you, Clara. I've heard the story. You haven't heard this version. Agnes looked at her directly. The new version is that you found a problem in Ethan's records on purpose, that you went through those ledgers looking for leverage, that the whole thing, the friendship, the pies, the helping was an operation. The kitchen was very quiet. An operation, Clara repeated. That's the word Dorothea Marsh used. I heard it myself. Clara sat down, because this was the kind of thing that needed to be received sitting down. She thought about the note she had kept, the dried apple crate, the creek path she had taken every morning for 6 days, the ledgers on her kitchen table at 10 at night. She thought about standing in the cold of the South pasture with a man who was learning for the first time in 2 years that the world had not finished with him. She thought about all of it, and then she thought about something Ethan had said months ago in the quiet of a rainy afternoon. I need to know why someone like you still believes I'm worth feeding. She thought about the answer she had given because you are, and she thought about how simple it was. How completely cleanly simple. And she thought about how much energy it took to defend a simple truth against people who had decided a complicated lie was more interesting. Agnes, she said. Yes. Has anyone who has said these things ever actually spoken to me about my intentions? Agnes paused. No. Have they spoken to Ethan? I don't believe so. Then their opinion is built on nothing, Clara said. And I am going to continue doing what I have been doing, which is running my shop and telling the truth and standing by what I know is right. And if Dorothea Marsh finds that story less interesting than the one she's invented, that is genuinely not my problem. Agnes looked at her for a moment. Then she sat down. All right, she said. What do you need from me? Clara looked at her, surprised just slightly. I need you to tell the truth if people ask you, she said. Tell them what you have actually seen, not what you've heard, what you know. "I know you work harder than anyone in this town," Agnes said. "I know you've given credit to families who couldn't pay and never made them feel small about it. I know you helped Ethan Calloway not because of what he owns, but because you're the kind of woman who helps people, and you've been that kind of woman since before he ever walked through your door." Clara felt the particular ache of being seen accurately by someone who had not been asked to look. "Thank you," she said. Agnes stood. "Two things," she said. "First, whatever this is between you and Ethan Calloway, it's visible from the street. Not in a bad way. In the way that something genuine always is. And the people who want to make it ugly are always going to be outnumbered by the people who can recognize the real thing." "And the second thing," Clara said. Agnes Fairbanks gave her a look that was both frank and warm. "Stop being so careful," she said. "You have earned the right to want something." She left. Clara sat in her kitchen for a long time after that, not moving, listening to the morning sounds of Red Hollow waking up around her. The clang of the blacksmith down the street. A dog somewhere. The particular creak of the building when the wind pushed against the north side. She thought about careful. She had been careful for 2 years. She had been careful before that in the way that women learn to be careful when the world makes clear that the consequences of not being careful fall on them most heavily. She had been careful with her money and her reputation and her work and her heart, and careful had kept her alive and functioning and genuinely on most days grateful for her life. But Agnes Fairbanks was right. There was a point where careful stopped being a survival strategy and started being a cage. And she was beginning to think she had been standing inside that cage for a while now, picking at the lock without quite admitting to herself that she was doing it. She stood up. She went to the oven. She made pie. And when Ethan came on Saturday, because he always came on Saturday, which was itself a kind of declaration the most reliable fact in her current life, she did not wait for him to come through the door. She had the coffee poured before she heard his horse. She had the pie on the table, and when he came through the door and stopped at the sight of the table already set, she looked at him and said without any particular preamble, "I want to talk about what happens after." I took off his hat. "After Hoskins. After the court case. After the resolution. After all of this is settled, and there's no crisis to manage and no evidence to organize." She looked at him directly. "What happens then, between us?" He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he came in and sat down and picked up the coffee and held it in both hands, and looked at her with the complete, unhurried attention that she had come to understand was how he loved things slowly and totally, and without reservation. "I've been thinking about that too," he said. And he set down the coffee. "I would like," he said, "to keep coming on Saturdays, not for the pie." He paused. "For you." She looked at him. "I would like to ride out to your shop when it isn't Saturday sometimes," he continued, "for the same reason." "All right," she said. "I would like to stop keeping us a quiet thing that the town guesses at," he said. "Because the people making assumptions in the dark are making bad ones, and I think we deserve better than that." "We do," she said, "and I would like—" He stopped, looked at his hands, then back at her. "I would like to give this the room it's been asking for, without deciding ahead of time what it becomes, without putting a fence around it." Clara looked at the man across her table, the man who had walked into her shop 8 months ago and bought apple pie and said nothing and walked out again, who had carried his grief with such discipline that it had become its own kind of prison, who had arrived before dawn at her back door with a ledger and a crisis and had not gone anywhere else, who had shown her the south pasture on a cold Sunday morning and told her why it mattered, who held her hand in an open yard in front of his foreman and let go slowly. "Without offense," she said. "Yes." That's a significant statement from a man who makes his living building them. That surprised a laugh out of him, a real one, full and unguarded, and she committed the sound of it to memory, because it was, she thought, one of the finest things she had heard in years. "I suppose it is," he said. She smiled. He smiled back. And for the first time in 2 years, Clara Whitfield sat across a table from someone and felt clearly and without qualification that the future was a place she was genuinely glad to be going toward. The case was still pending. Hoskins was still fighting. The county commissioner's involvement meant months of additional process, and Hart had warned them both that it would not be clean or quick. None of that had changed. But something else had changed, and it had changed completely. Clara picked up her coffee. "Stay for dinner," she said. Ethan looked at her. "Yes," he said. Simple as that. Dinner lasted 3 hours. Not because either of them had planned it that way, but because conversation between two people who have spent months being careful with each other and have finally stopped being careful tends to expand to fill whatever space is available. They talked about things that had nothing to do with ledgers or liens or Gerald Hoskins things that had been accumulating quietly, waiting for a moment exactly like this one. A Saturday evening in Clara's kitchen with the lamp burning low and the smell of the meal she'd made still in the air. He told her about his father. Not the version people knew, the pioneer, the land claimer, the man who started the Calloway Ranch from 160 acres and a belief in his own labor. The private version. The version where his father was also a man who worked so hard he forgot to come home some evenings, and a young Ethan had learned that love was demonstrated through effort rather than presence, and how that lesson had shaped him in ways he was still unfolding. She told him about Ohio, about her father's schoolroom, and the particular quality of winter mornings in a house full of books, and about leaving it at 23, and how she had not known getting on that wagon with Thomas and everything they owned that she was leaving the last place that would ever feel entirely uncomplicated. She had not told anyone that before. She had not thought there was anyone who would understand the specific texture of that particular grief. Not the loss of a person, but the loss of a version of yourself that existed only in a place you couldn't go back to. Ethan understood it. He understood it so completely and so immediately that she stopped mid-sentence and looked at him, and he said quietly, "I know exactly what that is," and she believed him. He left at 9 o'clock, which was not late by most measures, but late by the measures of a man who was at work before sunrise and had a ranch hand with a sick horse he needed to check before morning. He stood at the door and put on his coat and said, "I'll come Tuesday, if that's agreeable." "It's agreeable," she said. "Not Saturday." "I noticed." "I'm done waiting for Saturdays," he said. She looked at him. "Come Tuesday." He came Tuesday, and Thursday, and Saturday, and the following Tuesday again. The town, of course it noticed. Red Hollow noticed everything, but the quality of what it noticed had shifted. Because there is a difference between what people say about two people who are trying to hide something and what they say about two people who have stopped hiding anything, and that difference is not always what you expect. Transparency, it turned out, was its own form of protection. When there was nothing to speculate about, speculation lost its entertainment value. Dorothea Marsh tried once more a pointed comment at the dry goods store about the impropriety of a single woman receiving a gentleman caller on a weekday evening. Agnes Fairbanks, who happened to be standing 2 feet away, said pleasantly, and at full volume, "Ethan Calloway fixes Clara's chair legs and brings her dried apples, and she found the evidence that saved his ranch from a fraudulent land scheme. I think we can let the propriety worry about itself." The dry goods store went quiet for a moment. Then someone laughed, not cruelly, just with the recognition of a thing that was true. And Dorothea Marsh took her purchase and left, and was after that notably less vocal on the subject. The case against Hoskins ground forward through March and into April. Hart proved to be exactly the kind of attorney who was infuriating to opponents, precisely because he was methodical rather than dramatic. He did not rush. He built the case the way a good fence was built, post by post, each one set firmly before the next was started. Patterson's letter anchored the intimidation charge. The ink and handwriting analysis of the altered ledger provided by a document examiner Hart brought from Denver anchored the fraud charge. And the other two ranchers, Hart had identified men named Garfield and Pruitt, who had both lost land to Hoskins in the previous 3 years, through suspiciously similar water rights claims, came forward once Hart reached them and told them what had been discovered. That was the development that changed the scope of everything, because 2 additional victims meant the pattern was documented. It meant Gerald Hoskins was not a man who had made a sharp business decision once he was a man who had built a system. He had cultivated a county clerk. He had identified land. He filed false claims against it. used the legal machinery of the territory to tie up titles until financially pressured ranchers sold at reduced prices and pocketed the difference. He had been doing it for at least 4 years. Hart brought this information to Ethan on a Thursday afternoon in April. Ethan came directly to Clara's shop because that was by then simply where he went with things that mattered. He arrived while she was closing up and told her all of it standing in her shop with the late afternoon sun coming through the window. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "He was going to do this to Garfield and Pruitt, regardless of what you did or didn't do. He was going to do it to you, regardless of whether I existed. This was never about you specifically." "No," Ethan said. "It was about the land. It's always been about the land." "Which means stopping him stops it for the next person too." "Yes." She looked at him. "Then it needed to be stopped." Ethan looked at her steadily. "Hart wants to know if you'll testify. He's asked me to ask you again now that the scope has expanded. It won't be a small proceeding anymore. It'll be a district court case, possibly higher. There will be attorneys trying to—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she repeated. "Tell Hart yes." "Clara, this has gotten considerably larger than—" "I know what it's gotten to," she said. "I've been watching it get there. My answer is the same as it was in February. I know what I found, and how I found it, and what Patterson said to me in this shop, and I will say all of it in open court under oath as many times as it takes." She looked at him without any wavering at all. "What Hoskins did to Garfield and to Pruitt and to you, he did it because he believed no one would put it all together. Because he believed people would fight alone and lose alone, and nobody would ever see the whole picture." She paused. "I want to be in that courtroom. I want him to look at me and understand that someone saw the whole picture." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He's going to try to destroy your reputation," he said. "His attorneys will go after everything. Your finances, your motives, your relationship with me." "Let them," she said. "Clara." "Ethan." She said it firmly. "I have built everything I have from nothing. I have done it honestly and without asking anyone for anything I hadn't earned. My reputation is the one thing I am completely unafraid to put in front of a room full of people because it will hold up to every examination." She looked at him. "Will you let me do this?" He held her gaze for a long time. "Yes," he said, and then quieter. "I'll be there." "I know," she said. The hearing was set for the second week of May. The 2 weeks before. It were the strangest of Clara's recent experience. Not tense exactly, but heightened the way everything feels in the days before something large and unalterable. She kept her ordinary routine with the discipline of long practice, the early mornings, the oven, the customers, the accounts. She ate well and slept enough and did not allow herself to spiral into the particular anxiety of rehearsing things she had no control over. She had given her statement. She knew her facts. The rest was Hart's work. But 3 days before the hearing, something happened that she had not anticipated. She was closing up the shop on a Wednesday evening when she heard footsteps she didn't recognize, heavier than Ethan's more than one person. She looked up from the counter to find 2 men in the doorway, one of whom she did not know, and one of whom she recognized as a deputy from the county sheriff's office. Her heart went tight. "Miss Whitfield," the deputy said. He had the carefully neutral face of a man delivering something he had not written. "I've been asked to inform you that Mr. Hoskins's attorneys have filed a motion to have your testimony excluded on grounds of partiality." She looked at him. "They're arguing that your relationship with the defendant—" He paused. "With Mr. Calloway. That it constitutes a conflict of interest that disqualifies you as a credible witness." The shop was very quiet. "Is the motion likely to succeed?" she said. "That's for the judge to determine. Hearing on the motion is Friday morning, before the main proceeding." They left. Clara stood at the counter for a moment. Then she went to the back room and sat down and looked at the wall and thought about Gerald Hoskins, who had tried bribery and now was trying procedural exclusion, who was methodically working through every available instrument of pressure, with the determined creativity of a man who understood that the evidence against him was real, and his only path was to remove the people who could present it. She thought about the 2 possibilities. If the motion succeeded and her testimony was excluded, Hart still had the document examiner from Denver, still had Garfield and Pruitt, still had the ledger itself. It would hurt the case, but not kill it. But if her testimony was included, if she stood in that courtroom and said plainly and under oath exactly what she had found and how and why Hoskins had no answer for it. Because the truth was not complicated. It was clear, and it was documented, and it was what actually happened. She got up. She walked to Ethan's ranch because it was too late to send the boy, and she needed to tell him herself. She rode the main road, not the creek path, because she had not taken the creek path in 2 months, and she was not going to start now. He was in the yard when she arrived, and she could see by the way he read her face as she dismounted that he understood something had happened. She told him about the motion. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she valued most about him, the way he took in information completely before responding without filling the space with reassurance he couldn't guarantee. When she finished, he said, "Hart needs to know tonight." "I know. Can you wire him?" "I'll ride to the telegraph office myself." He was already moving toward the barn. Then he stopped and turned. "Are you all right?" She looked at him, considered the question honestly the way she always did. "I'm angry," she said, "but I'm not afraid." He held her gaze. Something moved in his face, something that was not quite the almost smile and not quite the full one, but occupied the exact space between them, warm and specific, and entirely meant for her. "Good," he said. He wired Hart. Hart filed a counterbrief that same night. On Friday morning, Clara sat in the county courtroom, a plain, practical room that smelled of wood and paper and the particular seriousness of official proceedings, and listened to Hart argue before the judge that her testimony was not only admissible, but essential. He argued it with the methodical confidence she had come to associate with him, building each point on the last. And when Hoskins's attorney tried to characterize her relationship with Ethan as disqualifying Hart, said something that Clara would remember clearly for the rest of her life. He said, "Your Honor, Miss Whitfield found the evidence of fraud on her own initiative, documented it before informing Mr. Calloway, and immediately provided it to counsel. She then documented the attempted intimidation by Mr. Hoskins's own agent on the same day it occurred. If we are to exclude witnesses on grounds of personal connection to a victim, we will find that fraud is considerably easier to commit, since fraudsters consistently target people with connections to each other. The question is not whether Miss Whitfield knows Mr. Calloway. The question is whether what she found is true. And it is. The judge ruled that her testimony would stand. Hoskins's attorney looked for the first time like a man who understood he was losing. The main hearing ran 2 days. Clara testified on the afternoon of the first day. She sat in the witness chair and answered every question Hart asked with the same clarity and precision she had brought to her account books for 2 years, specific, organized, without embellishment. When Hoskins's attorney cross-examined her, she answered those questions the same way. She did not waver. She did not grow defensive. She did not look at Ethan, who was sitting directly in her eye line in the gallery, because she understood that what she needed to project in that room was not a woman defending someone she cared for, but a woman stating facts she knew to be true, and those were not the same thing. When the attorney said with a particular emphasis, "Is it not true, Miss Whitfield, that you stand to benefit personally from the outcome of this case?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I stand to benefit from the truth being on record. Yes, I believe that's a benefit to everyone in this territory who owns land." The room was quiet. Hart did not smile, but he came close. The ruling came on the morning of the second day. Gerald Hoskins was found guilty of fraud in the alteration of public records and guilty of attempted bribery of a material witness. The fraudulent lien on Ethan's south pasture was voided. The properties of Garfield and Pruitt acquired under the same scheme were ordered to be reviewed for restitution. And the county clerk, Hoskins' cousin, was formally referred to the district attorney for his own proceedings. Clara was sitting in the gallery for the ruling. She heard each count read aloud with the same quiet attention she brought to everything. When the final count was read, she did not cheer. She was not a person who cheered in courtrooms, but she felt something release in her chest that had been held tight since the night she'd found the altered ledger entry and understood what it meant. She looked at Ethan, who was sitting 2 seats away from her. He was looking at her. He nodded. She nodded back. They walked out of the courtroom together into the May morning and stood on the steps while people moved around them, and he looked at her with the full, unguarded expression of a man who has no more walls in the direction of this particular person. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she said. He took her hand. In front of the courthouse, on the steps, in full view of every person coming in or out. She let him. They stood there for a while, and the world went on around them, and neither of them moved to rush toward whatever came next. What came next was spring. The kind of spring that Wyoming Territory produced when it decided to make up for the winter fast and green and insistent. The land coming back with the particular determination of things that have been suppressed and are not interested in being suppressed any longer. The Calloway Ranch came out of the season in better shape than Ethan had allowed himself to hope. The south pasture clear and unencumbered, the north grazing operation expanded now that the legal cloud had lifted. He hired Tommy on permanently and added another hand, and the ranch moved into its busiest season with the uncomplicated momentum of a thing that has been properly maintained. Clara moved into her busiest season too. In June she signed a new lease, not on the space she currently occupied, but on a larger one. 2 doors down the space that had been empty since the previous tenant left for Cheyenne. It was twice the size of what she had. It had a proper storefront window and a back room large enough for 2 ovens and a workspace that would not require her to choose between projects. It was, she had calculated with the thoroughness she brought to all financial decisions, manageable. Just manageable. It would require everything she had saved and then careful management for the first year. She signed the lease on a Tuesday morning and went directly to Ethan's ranch and told him, because telling him things had become the reflex she had not had for 2 years and was not interested in suppressing. He listened to the whole plan. The numbers, the timeline, the risk calculation. Then he said, "What do you need?" "Nothing," she said. "It's manageable on my own." He looked at her. "That's not what I asked." She understood the distinction. It was the distinction he had been teaching her quietly through months of small actions. The difference between what you can carry alone and what you might choose to let someone help you carry. "The shelving," she said. "I can't build it myself, and I can't afford to hire it done right now." "I'll build it," he said. "Ethan, Clara." He said it with the particular finality she had learned meant he had decided something and was not interested in argument on the point. "I'll build the shelving." He built the shelving over 3 weekends in July. He brought Tommy to help, and the 2 of them worked with the quiet efficiency of people who understood carpentry and were not going to make a ceremony of it. Clara kept them in coffee and food and did not offer to help because she understood that this was his version of what she had given him, the specific gift of being useful to someone you cared about in a way that costs you something real. The new shop opened in August. She had a sign above the door. Her name carved in clean letters, Clara Whitfield. Nothing else. She did not need anything else. The morning it opened, before the first customer arrived, she stood inside the new space alone and looked at the shelves Ethan had built solid and level and fitted with the meticulous attention he brought to all his work. And she thought about a woman who had started over at 25 with $14 and a pie recipe. She thought about what that woman had believed was possible and what she had not dared believe was possible. And she looked at the gap between those 2 things and found that it was smaller than she had feared and larger than she had let herself hope. She thought about Thomas, who had believed in good odds and good land and had been wrong about both, but who had loved her in the way that young people love when they believe the world is going to hold up its end of an agreement. She did not grieve him any less than she had. But grief, she had learned, was not a finite thing that depleted as time passed. It was more like weather. It changed character, became something you could see coming and prepare for, something that passed through, rather than staying forever. And in the intervals between it, the sun was genuinely warm. She thought about Ethan, who was at the ranch this morning because the ranch required him to be, and who had said last night, standing at her back door, "I'll come by this afternoon, after the opening." Simply, without making a declaration of it. The door opened. Her first customer was Agnes Fairbanks, carrying a small bunch of wildflowers from somewhere, who set them on the counter and said, "Well, There it is. There it is, Clara agreed. By noon the shop was full. Ethan arrived at 4, as he had said, and stood inside the door for a moment, and looked at the shelves, and the customers, and the sign above the door, and something passed over his face that she had learned to read. Not the almost smile, not the full one, but the expression that existed underneath both of them. The bedrock one, the one that said without any of the complications of language that he was glad. That the world had this in it. That the world had her in it. He sat at the table by the window. She poured his coffee without being asked. Same as always. Only nothing was the same, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say it. "Good day," he said. "Very good," she said. "Shelves holding up." She looked at the shelves. "They're perfect." He looked at his coffee. "I need to ask you something." She looked at him. His voice had a quality she recognized, not the controlled seriousness of a man delivering information, but the particular quality of a man who has been holding something in long enough and has decided that today is the day. "Ask," she said. He set down the coffee. He looked at her the way he looked at things he had decided about fully, without reservation, without the elaborate caution that had once stood between him and everything that mattered. "I would like," he said carefully, "for this to be permanent." The shop was full of the sounds of the afternoon. Other customers. The street outside, the ordinary noise of a day going about its business. Clara heard all of it, and none of it. "Permanent," she said. "You and I," he said. "Not," he paused. "Not a careful arrangement. Not Saturdays and Tuesdays and the thing we don't name out loud. I want to name it. I want everyone in this town and this territory to know what it is." He met her eyes. "I'm asking you to marry me, Clara." She looked at him. She thought about a rainy January afternoon, and a warm pie, and a question she hadn't known how to answer. "I need to know why someone like you still believes I'm worth feeding." She thought about what she had said, and what she had meant, and the fact that both, it turned out, had been the truest things she had said in years. She thought about what it had cost both of them to get to this table. The grief, the loss, the careful walls, the slow, patient work of learning to let someone see you, when every instinct you'd built over years of surviving said that being seen was the most dangerous thing a person could allow. She thought about Thomas. She thought about Ruth. She thought about the particular way that love, when it is genuine, does not ask you to forget the people who shaped you. It simply makes room for itself beside them. She looked at Ethan Calloway, who had walked into her shop to buy a plain apple pie and stayed eventually for everything. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. Same gesture. He had been making it since February, quietly and without ceremony. And she understood now that it had always been this simple, this direct, this honest. The afternoon went on around them. Agnes Fairbanks from across the shop noticed and said nothing, which was its own kind of eloquence. Outside Red Hollow continued its ordinary life, indifferent to the fact that in a new bakery on Main Street, two people who had each learned the hard way that the world could take. Everything were sitting across a table from each other and choosing not out of need, not out of loneliness, not out of any of the lesser reasons people sometimes came together, but out of the clearest, most deliberate yes that either of them had ever said. They were not a perfect couple. They had never been that, and they would never be that, and neither of them wanted it. Perfection was for people who hadn't lived enough to know what was actually worth wanting. They were two people who had buried people they loved and rebuilt themselves from the wreckage, and found in the process that what they had built was strong enough to share. That was what Red Hollow eventually remembered when people there talked about the widow and the rancher, about the pie on a rainy afternoon, and the ledger and the courtroom, and the sign above a bakery door. They remembered that it had not been easy. They remembered that it had cost something. And they remembered that two people who had every reason to stay safely alone had chosen stubbornly and deliberately something harder and better